Hey folks, tonight we're going back, way back, to a time when gods walked among men, or at least when men pretended they did. Before TikTok, before Netflix, before modern plumbing, there was Greece. And no, not the one with beach resorts and bouzouki music. We're talking ancient Greece. Temples, togas, olive oil being used for everything except cooking. But more specifically, we're talking festivals. The kind of festivals that made modern music festivals look like quiet afternoons at the DMV. Dionysian parades, blood-soaked altars, naked races, public feasts, and enough wine to make your therapist concerned. But before we dive into the dance parties of Delphi or the drama of the Dionysia, let me set the scene. First, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you find pleasure in the mildly unhinged corners of history, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Bonus points if you're doing so on a chitin. Now, dim the lights. Maybe light a candle. If you're feeling dramatic, go full ancient and smear a bit of olive oil on your arms. Not necessary, just traditional. Let's journey back. Before Instagram influencers told us what joy looked like, the ancient Greeks had another way of doing it. They had the oracle. Yes, the famous Oracle of Delphi, the original gatekeeper of vibes. A woman so powerful, so cryptic, she could make a vague horoscope sound like divine law. People traveled across seas, over mountains, and through bandit-infested roads to ask her the most pressing questions of their lives. Will I win this war? Should I plant barley this season? Is my wife cheating or just doing pottery at odd hours? And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd tell them when to celebrate. See, festivals in ancient Greece weren't just social gatherings. They were sacred schedules, holy hangovers with divine permission. The gods weren't just invited, they were the guests of honor. If you missed a festival, it wasn't like skipping a friend's birthday. It was more like ghosting Zeus, which, for the record, was a terrible idea. So where did these festivals begin? According to legend, it started with a whisper. A divine murmur from the earth's navel, Delphi. The oracle declared, "To honor the gods is to honor the self. Let joy be ritual. Let ritual be joy." And just like that, ancient Greece became a party that never quite ended. But let's not romanticize too quickly. These weren't all parades and fig cakes. Some of these festivals were, well, let's call them spiritually intense. And tonight, we're starting with one of the strangest ones. It was called the Anthesteria, the Festival of Flowers. Sounds wholesome, right? Wrong. Because while the Anthesteria did celebrate spring and wine and rebirth, it also involved ghosts. Yes, actual ghosts. Every year in late February, the people of Athens would gather to open the new wine from the previous year's harvest. This was Dionysius's moment, the god of wine, madness, theater, and suspicious decision-making. And in true Dionysian fashion, the first thing they did was drink. A lot. The first day of the festival was called Pythagogia, or jar opening. It began with every household opening their storage jars of wine, the good stuff, or the stuff that had aged just enough to no longer taste like disappointment. It was a solemn moment. Offerings were made, libations were poured, children were sent away. Because day 2, that's when things got weird. The second day of Anthesteria was called Choes. It was a drinking contest. Not a polite wine tasting, a literal competition to see who could chug a jug of wine the fastest without talking. Yes, silence was mandatory. Why? Because this was the day the dead walked among the living. See, the Greeks believed that during Anthesteria, the barrier between the underworld and the mortal world thinned, like the Wi-Fi signal at a crowded Starbucks. Spirits, known as kig, would slip through.
Not necessarily malevolent, but definitely uninvited. So, Athenians would seal their doors with pitch. They'd smear the thresholds. They wouldn't speak during the contest, not because they were introverts, but because silence was thought to protect the soul. You drink, you stay quiet, you hope no one ghostly sits next to you. And yes, this was still considered a celebration. To make matters stranger, the priestess of Dionysus would undergo a mock marriage ceremony to the god himself. She would enter his temple alone, a symbolic act meant to reaffirm the union between the city and its most chaotic deity. What happened in that temple? No one knows. Which, frankly, is exactly how cultic mystery rites should work. By day 3, the living had had enough. The final day of Anthesteria was called Chitroi, or the pots. Offerings of cooked grains were made to Hermes, the god of transitions, of boundaries, of ghost escorts. Basically the divine Uber for souls. These pots were not shared with family. They were left out for the dead. As if to say, thanks for visiting, please enjoy your to-go meal and return to the underworld now. And then, just to make sure the spirits took the hint, the Athenians would shout them away. Kehis, go home! That's not a joke. That was the traditional phrase. A spiritual eviction notice. No priest necessary. It sounds bizarre, but it served a purpose. It reminded the Greeks of the fragile boundary between life and death, joy and madness, wine and poison. And who better to blur that line than Dionysus? So, next time you sip a glass of wine and feel a little strange, just know you're participating in a tradition that once involved silence, ghosts, and a woman marrying a god in a darkened temple. And that's just one festival. Stick around. Because up next, we talk about naked foot races, whipped backs, and why Spartan boys bled for Artemis.
We wandered through Athens at midnight, whispering to ghosts and pouring out wine like a drunk seance. But not every Greek festival was about charm, poetry, or chatting with the dead. Some were about pain, very public pain. And for that, we have to travel to Sparta. Now, if Athens was the nerdy kid in class, quoting Homer, Sparta was the kid who showed up barefoot, flexed in gym, and then wrestled the substitute teacher just to prove a point. Their festivals reflected that. The one I'm about to describe sounds less like religion and more like hazing with better branding. He was dedicated to Artemis Orthia, the goddess of the hunt, childbirth, and apparently creative child discipline. Here's the setup. Every year, Spartan boys trained in the Agoge, the state-sponsored military school, were marched into a sanctuary. And not just any sanctuary, a place where the statue of Artemis was rumored to be so wild that it had to be chained down. Yes, the statue. They thought it would physically attack people if it wasn't bolted in place. Nothing screams holy atmosphere quite like an idol that might punch you. Now, in front of this chained goddess, the boys performed a ritual called diamastigosis, which translates very literally to being whipped. And it was exactly that. Teenagers were lined up shirtless in front of the altar, while priests whipped them with sticks and leather cords until their skin broke open. Meanwhile, the crowd clapped, cheered, and occasionally placed bets on who could last the longest without collapsing. Imagine a state fair, but instead of fried food and Ferris wheels, it's screaming children bleeding on an altar. This wasn't considered cruel, it was considered character building. See, in Sparta, pain wasn't an inconvenience, it was a teacher. The ability to withstand it without flinching was proof of discipline, loyalty, and potential. So when a boy gritted his teeth and stood tall, the crowd didn't just cheer, they saw the future of their army. But here's the dark part. Sometimes the boys didn't just walk away sore, they died. And instead of halting the practice, Spartans shrugged and said, well, at least Artemis is satisfied. The Romans, who were not exactly squeamish, traveled to watch this spectacle as tourists. They thought it was exotic, maybe even entertaining.
Yes, in a world that invented gladiators and crucifixions, Spartan child whipping was considered worth the trip. But before you think this was all doom and welts, let me add a twist. At some point in its history, the festival added a new feature: cheese. Yes, cheese. Here's how it worked. A large pile of cheese was placed on the altar of Artemis. The Spartan boys had one task: snatch the cheese. The catch? Priests stood around the altar, whipping anyone who got close. So picture this: desperate teenagers lunging at dairy products while robed priests swung whips like they were defending a fridge at 3 a.m. from raccoons. If you managed to grab the cheese, you were a local legend. If you failed, you were just bleeding and empty-handed. And the cheese wasn't symbolic either. Cheese was practical, valuable, and deeply Spartan. It was food, protein, and muscle fuel. In other words, worth getting scarred over. Some historians believe this entire spectacle was a toned-down version of earlier, darker practices. Perhaps, once upon a time, human sacrifice was involved and the whipping was a safer substitute. Whether that's true or just academic gossip, the ritual remained an annual staple for centuries. Now here's where the contrast really hits. While the boys were being whipped to exhaustion, Spartan girls were also present, but not as participants. They were performers. Young women in white robes sang hymns, danced in circles, and honored Artemis through music. It was elegance on one side, brutality on the other, beauty and blood. That duality was the point. Artemis wasn't just a goddess of the hunt, she was a goddess of thresholds. Pain and endurance were as much a part of life as birth and joy. The girls praised the goddess, the boys bled for her. Together, the rituals created balance. And balance was everything in Sparta. Still, let's not sugarcoat it. To modernize, this looks like institutionalized abuse with a dairy prize. But to Spartans, it was sacred. To flinch was to fail. To endure was divine. And in case you're wondering, no, you didn't get a medal or a trophy for winning. You got cheese. Maybe some bragging rights, and of course, scars that made you look extra tough at dinner. It's worth noting that the festival of Artemis Orthia became so iconic that even when Sparta lost its power, the ritual didn't just vanish. It survived. Even in later Greek and Roman times, writers described it with a mixture of horror and fascination. Archaeologists today have uncovered figurines and votive offerings at the sanctuary, tiny statues of warriors, animals, and dancers, all reminders of a festival where the divine demanded flesh. So yes, the ancient Greeks had festivals filled with laughter, plays, and wine, but they also had festivals where teenagers were whipped for cheese. And that's the spectrum of human culture in a nutshell, or in this case, in a wheel of dairy. But don't worry, we're heading back to Athens next, and this time instead of bloodletting, you'll get an all-day theater binge with goats, masks, and heckling crowds. Because if the Spartans made pain into a ritual, the Athenians turned storytelling into religion. And one of them invented tragedy. The other invented trauma.
If you're just tuning in, we've gone from haunted wine drinking in Athens to ceremonial floggings in Sparta. So naturally, it's time to talk about theater. Because what else do you do after ghosts and beatings? Let's head to Athens again, but this time we're not chasing spirits. We're chasing applause. Welcome to the city Dionysia, the original binge-watch experience, except instead of Netflix, it was performed live, outdoors, and usually involved a goat. No, really, we'll get to the goat. But first, some ambiance. Imagine the year is 472 BCE. You're an Athenian citizen. You've survived winter. Taxes have been paid. The Persians are temporarily gone, and the city Dionysia is about to begin. This wasn't just a festival. It was the festival. A multi-day, citywide extravaganza honoring Dionysus. Yes, him again, because apparently being god of wine, madness, ghosts, and impromptu weddings wasn't enough. He also got to invent theater. You didn't just attend the city Dionysia, you prepared for it. People came from all over the Greek world, diplomats, merchants, tourists, drama nerds. The city hosted sacred processions, parades, sacrifices, and, most famously, a 3-day competitive drama marathon that would have made even Shakespeare nervous. So, what did that look like? Let's start with the opening ceremony, a massive torch-lit procession called the Pompe. Thousands marched from the outskirts of the city to the Theater of Dionysius at the base of the Acropolis. There were dancers, musicians, priests, city officials, and a very important statue of Dionysus himself. Yes, the statue had a seat of honor. Because if you're throwing a festival in honor of a god, the least you can do is save him a front-row ticket. And then came the sacrifices. This is where the goat comes in. Before the performances began, a goat was sacrificed at the theater as an offering to Dionysus. This wasn't symbolic, it was literal. Blood on the altar, entrails examined, the whole ancient shebang. Some scholars even believe that the term tragedy comes from tragodia, meaning goat song. Whether that's true or just a delightful etymological rumor, it certainly sets the tone. Now, on to the performances. Each competing playwright would present a tetralogy. That's 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play, a sort of raunchy comedy. Think ancient SNL meets faun cosplay. These were not short productions. You showed up at dawn, you stayed all day, you brought food, cushions, wine, and probably an opinion. Attendance wasn't optional. In fact, the state paid poor citizens to attend. Think about that. Ancient Athens considered theater so essential to civic life that they created a program called the Theorica, festival welfare, to make sure even the broke folks could cry over Oedipus in row 7. And they cried, they did. The plays were emotionally intense, politically sharp, and often involved death, madness, betrayal, or divine trickery. Fun for the whole family. But it wasn't all tears and incestuous plot twists. The satyr plays, performed at the end, were wild comedic romps full of body jokes, slapstick, and very enthusiastic costume choices. Let's pause there, because we need to talk about costumes. Actors wore full-body robes, platform shoes called cothurni, and oversized masks with exaggerated expressions. The masks weren't just theatrical, they were necessary. The theater seated up to 17,000 people. You couldn't see a subtle smirk from the back row. You needed a face the size of a dinner plate. And no, there were no actresses. All roles, even women, were played by men, which means that every tragic queen, every heartbroken daughter, and every vengeful goddess was portrayed by a guy sweating under 5 layers of linen and a beard glued on with pine resin. And yet, despite the masks, the goats, and the cross-dressing, this wasn't frivolous. Greek theater was sacred. It was both entertainment and ritual, art and offering. The chorus wasn't just a narrative device, it was a stand-in for the city itself. Watching these plays was meant to be a kind of catharsis, a purging of emotion, a communal reckoning. Which explains why they had judges. Yes, plays were judged, not by popular vote, but by a complex system involving drawn names, sealed ballots, and occasional bribery. The winning playwright received a wreath, public recognition, and eternal bragging rights. Losers? Still legends. Many of the losing plays are now considered masterpieces. No pressure. Some of the most famous names in Western literature came from this tradition. Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and, of course, Aristophanes, the king of political satire. He wrote comedies that mocked politicians, philosophers, and even other playwrights, kind of like a roast, but with more sandals. But don't assume the audience was polite. If they didn't like your play, They booed loudly. They heckled. They threw figs, possibly rocks. Some plays were banned. Some playwrights exiled. This was not a passive viewing experience. This was Yelp in togas. And yet, the city Dionysia wasn't just about drama. It was a chance for Athens to show off. Between plays, the city paraded orphans of fallen soldiers, handed out military honors, and reminded everyone that democracy and death taxes were alive and well. It was political theater inside actual theater. And it was personal, because every story reflected something real. Questions of fate, power, justice, pride. Should you kill your mother if she murdered your father? What happens when a king defies the gods? What is the cost of truth? Big questions, big masks, big applause. And after all that, after the plays, the wine flowed again, because in the end, it was still Dionysus's party. So next time you binge a drama series and feel emotionally drained after 6 episodes, remember, the Greeks did it first. They just had better acoustics and more livestock. Coming up next, a festival for women only. No men allowed, not even statues with beards. And what did they do there? You'll see.
So far, we've seen ghost wine, ritualized whipping, and theatrical goat songs. But tonight, we're peeking into something even more mysterious, something ancient, powerful, and extremely exclusive. Because this time, we're talking about a festival that men weren't even allowed to witness. And if they tried, they could be killed. Seriously. Let's talk about the Thesmophoria. An all-women's festival, no husbands, no sons, no male servants, not even a curious guy with a fake wig and good intentions. This was sacred space. A time when women didn't just participate in religion, they ran it. But to understand the Thesmophoria, you first need to meet its VIP guest list. Demeter, goddess of grain, fertility, and harvest, and Persephone, her daughter, who famously got abducted by Hades and made the entire world wither because she wouldn't text back. The Thesmophoria was a fertility ritual, not the romantic kind, the soil and womb kind, the kind where death and life were both invited to dinner and nobody made eye contact. So what exactly happened at this festival? Well, that's complicated, because the Thesmophoria was secret, like really secret. Even ancient historians admitted they didn't know the full story. And those who did know weren't talking. But what we do know is this. It took place in the fall, right before the sowing of crops. The timing wasn't casual, it was symbolic. The earth was being seeded, and so were the metaphors. The women who participated were usually married citizens, aka mothers. The whole thing was rooted in fertility, both agricultural and human. You couldn't just wander in with a flower crown and good vibes. You had to be initiated. And once you were in, you were in. Day 1 of the Thesmophoria was called Anodos, the ascent. Women climbed to a sacred site, often on a hill or acropolis, and set up camp. Literally, they camped there, outdoors, for 3 days. No husbands, no sons, no male servants. Not even a curious guy with a fake wig and good intentions. This was sacred space. A time when women didn't just participate in religion, they ran it. But to understand the Thesmophoria, you first need to meet its VIP guest list. Demeter, goddess of grain, fertility, and harvest, and Persephone, her daughter, who famously got abducted by Hades and made the entire world wither because she wouldn't text back. The Thesmophoria was a fertility ritual, not the romantic kind, the soil and womb kind, the kind where death and life were both invited to dinner and nobody made eye contact.
So what exactly happened at this festival? Well, that's complicated, because the Thesmophoria was secret, like really secret. Even ancient historians admitted they didn't know the full story, and those who did know weren't talking. But what we do know is this. It took place in the fall, right before the sowing of crops. The timing wasn't casual, it was symbolic. The earth was being seeded, and so were the metaphors. The women who participated were usually married citizens, aka mothers. The whole thing was rooted in fertility, both agricultural and human. You couldn't just wander in with a flower crown and good vibes. You had to be initiated. And once you were in, you were in. Day one of the Thesmophoria was called Anodos, the ascent. Women climbed to a sacred site, often on a hill or acropolis, and set up camp. Literally, they camped there. Outdoors, for 3 days. No husbands, no sons, no distractions. Just ancient Greek glamping with heavier symbolism and more sacrificial meat. They brought offerings, they sang hymns, they likely fasted, they told stories, probably, and yes, they probably drank. This was Greece, after all. Day 2, Nesti, the fasting. Now this was no spa retreat, this was symbolic mourning. Women commemorated Demeter's grief over losing Persephone. The earth was barren, so too was the body. They abstained from certain foods. They sat on the ground, sometimes on mats made of plants that discourage fertility, like fennel and mint. Not exactly the image of comfort. But this wasn't about comfort. This was ritual grief, because before life comes death, before harvest, silence, the pause before the bloom. And then, day 3, Kalligeneia, the fair birth. This was the moment of reversal. Grief gave way to joy. Seeds were planted, symbolically and literally. Women prayed for healthy children, fertile fields, and cosmic balance. They celebrated the goddess Kalligeneia, a deity of beautiful birth and generative power. And here's where things get wild. During the Thesmophoria, the women would retrieve rotting animal remains that had been left in underground pits months earlier. These were piglets, sometimes other animals, thrown into chasms called megara during an earlier festival. The remains were now decomposed, fermented, and absolutely pungent. Why? Because decay is sacred. Rot is transformation. These remains, once lifted from the earth, were believed to be powerfully fertile. Women mixed them with seeds and spread them on fields. It was grotesque. It was holy. It was ancient biohacking. Even the smell was part of the ritual. To be surrounded by death while praying for life, that's the kind of metaphor the Greeks absolutely adored. But remember, no men allowed. This was more than tradition, it was law. The sacredness of the Thesmophoria came from its female exclusivity. These women weren't just worshippers, they were ritual specialists, guardians of the life-death-life cycle. In one famous comedy by Aristophanes, Thesmophoria Zeusi, a male character tries to sneak into the festival dressed as a woman. Predictably, chaos ensues, because even in parody, the boundary was firm. This was not your space. For those 3 days, women ruled the religious landscape. They weren't there to entertain, to serve, or to be seen. They were there to commune with the earth, with the goddesses, with one another. And that made it powerful. You might be wondering, were the men cool with this? The answer is, they were terrified, and a little in awe. The Thesmophoria was considered critical to the success of the city-state.
If the crops failed, if childbirths went badly, if generational continuity broke down, it wasn't blamed on politics, it was blamed on cosmic imbalance. And that balance was maintained not in the battlefield or the assembly, but on a wind-swept hillside where women fasted, wept, rotted meat, and whispered to the gods. And when it ended, the women returned to their homes, quietly. No parades, no medals, just the knowledge that they had preserved the world. Again. Now, before you think every Greek festival was gender exclusive, don't worry. The next one was for everyone. It involved torches, nighttime processions, mystery cults, and initiations so secret that people risked execution just for revealing what happened. Because next, we're going to Eleusis. And no, you are not ready.
We've reached the final chapter. You've survived ghost feasts, sacred whippings, competitive theater, and rotten meat rituals. And now we step into the shadows, into a festival so secret, so powerful, that revealing its rites was punishable by death. This wasn't just a celebration. This was a mystery. Welcome to the Eleusinian Mysteries, a festival that promised not just joy, not just civic pride, but immortality. Yes, you heard that right. The Eleusinian Mysteries weren't about wine or theater or bloodletting. They were about the soul. They whispered to that ancient, aching part of us that asks, what happens when I die? And for the Greeks, the answer was hidden in Eleusis. Let's set the stage. Eleusis was a small town near Athens, quiet and unassuming except for the massive sanctuary dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Yes, them again. The mother and daughter, whose myth explained the seasons, grief, and rebirth. But here, their story wasn't just told, it was experienced. Every year, thousands of people from all over the Greek world would make a sacred pilgrimage from Athens to Eleusis. This wasn't a casual stroll. It was a formal procession along the Sacred Way, a dusty 14-mile route marked by song, torchlight, and ecstatic anticipation. The festival had two parts: the lesser mysteries, held in the spring for preliminary purification, and the greater mysteries, held in autumn. What we're talking about here are the greater mysteries, the main event. So who could participate? Almost anyone. Citizens, women, even slaves. All were welcome, as long as they spoke Greek, hadn't committed murder, and were willing to undergo initiation. And here is where it gets mysterious. Because what happened inside the telesterion, the great hall of initiation, was never written down. Ever. For over 1,000 years. We don't know the exact rituals. We don't know what was said. We don't know what was shown. What we do know is how people reacted. Plato hinted that those initiated no longer feared death. Cicero said it was the most important thing he had ever done. And generations of Greeks believed that in those darkened halls, something eternal was revealed. So what did the initiates do? First, they fasted. Then they drank a special potion called kykeon, a mixture of barley and mint that may or may not have been psychoactive. Modern scholars have debated this for decades. Was the kykeon laced with ergot, a naturally occurring fungus with LSD-like effects? Possibly. But it wasn't about tripping. It was about transformation. After days of ritual purification, symbolic reenactments, and public spectacle, the initiates were led into the telesterion. Torches burned. Sacred objects were revealed. And then, in complete silence, something happened. Something so profound that even the most skeptical participants left changed. Death was no longer terrifying. Life was no longer meaningless. Whatever they saw, whatever they heard, it convinced them that there was something more. And yet no one ever told, not even when threatened, not even under torture. When a playwright named Aeschylus was accused of revealing elements of the mysteries in one of his plays, he was nearly executed. He survived only by swearing he hadn't known, because the mysteries were sacred, not metaphorically, literally. You didn't joke about Eleusis. You didn't speculate. You went or you didn't, but you respected it. And perhaps that's why it endured for over 1,000 years. From the time of Homer to the rise of Christianity, the Eleusinian mysteries remained a central rite of Greek life. Emperors were initiated. Philosophers knelt at its altars. Even during war, Eleusis was left untouched, its sanctuary considered off-limits even to invaders. What were the secrets? We'll never know. That's the point. But scholars believe the entire ritual was a reenactment of Persephone's descent into the underworld and return to the light. Death, rebirth, return. The promise? That we too could return. That death was not the end. That beneath the soil lay not rot, but seed. That what died today might bloom tomorrow. It was ancient theology, cosmic theater, psychological transformation, and maybe, just maybe, an early glimpse into the collective unconscious. And after it was over, there were no parades, no goats, no feasts, just silence. Initiates didn't even speak to each other about what they saw, not because they forgot, but because the memory was enough. So as the fires dimmed and the pilgrims returned home, something had shifted. The gods were no longer distant. The soul was no longer alone. And now, so are we.